So you can fly to practical test standards, airspeed, bank, altitude, smack on. That's what the FAA wants, and that's what your CFI teaches.
But does that really prepare you for the real world? Does that give you the skills you need to get out of trouble? Well, maybe not.
But when you focus that much on the parameters of flight, you neglect the sensations. So then if you're in a flight situation where the sensations start to come in and those sensations are unfamiliar, that can degrade your performance.
Ed Wishmeyer studies loss of control accidents and based on what he's learned, developed something he calls E3. And that caught the attention of AOPA Air Safety Institute boss Richard McSpadden.
So Ed, to start with, can you summarize for people what is E3, Expanded Envelope Exercises? What is it?
E3 is really a philosophy and, of course, a bunch of exercises. And the idea is that pilots don't have accidents in their comfort zones. So if you can extend a pilot's comfort zone, that is their flight envelope, if you can expand that, then there will be more comfortable pilots, there'll be safer pilots, they'll get more joy from flying, and they'll probably fly more. So E3 is a philosophy that says, don't stop at the mechanics of the ACS or the regs or anything. Go beyond those and really see what the airplane will do and enjoy it.
Well, Richard explains more about E3 in his Safety Spotlight in the upcoming April issue of AOPA Pilot Magazine. And E3 exercises will soon be added into ASI's Focused Flight Review curriculum.
They're not really exercises with precise entry and exit parameters. That's not really the goal. The goal is to get a little farther outside your typical flight regime and just feel what that's like so it doesn't surprise you if you ever find yourself there.
Well, there are many different exercises designed to safely help you learn the feel of your airplane when it gets outside of your normal operating envelope.
Certainly the poster child for E3 is what I call the 60-90s. You start at the plane at a speed comparable to flying downwind in the traffic pattern, and you're at altitude and with flaps retracted. Using full aileron deflection, bank to 60 degrees, turn 90 degrees of turn, then full aileron deflection the other way, turn 90 degrees, so it's left, right, left, right. But what's different about this is you don't worry about airspeed, you don't worry about precise bank angles, and you don't worry about altitude so that you can focus on the sensations and see how much is going on rather than being distracted by airspeed and altitude.
Well, other exercises help pilots learn how to deal with botched base to final turns. Well, Tom, I'm looking forward to learning more about those exercises and going out in the 170 and trying them.
Yeah, it does sound like it'd be an interesting exercise. And the important thing is, to always remember that the FAA minimums are just that, and that we all need to kind of expand our envelope, if you will, and understand the sensations of the airplane and be able to go out and be safe flying the airplane pretty much in any part of the envelope.
All right, well, good afternoon, everybody, and hopefully we won't roast. This picture here shows the kind of airplanes you can fly E3 in. Regular, everyday airplanes. You don't need an aerobatic airplane. You don't need anything fancy. So what's E3 all about? First of all, it's about having fun. And let's put this in context. How many people have been to an aviation social event, dinner, pancake breakfast, where the topic was safety? Anybody? People have actually been at social events with safety. That's amazing. You guys are about the first. So we also want to be better pilots and safer pilots, and we want to learn in our own planes. We don't want to go pay somebody else's plane to learn to fly in. So what are the expanded envelope exercises? And we hit on this earlier. And these are exercises, not maneuvers. So we don't really care about holding altitude or airspeed. We want to get the sensations, the sight picture, so that when we're outside of the middle of the envelope, when we're over here, and we get these sensations, they don't distract us and detract from our skills. Depending upon what source you talk to, you can read that most pilots fly within only the middle 5 or 10% of the flight envelope. So we want pilots to be comfortable out here so that in case they get out there, it's not a big deal. They've seen it before. So, and this is based on background research. The research I've done just shy of 700 NTSB reports, and this is not reading the summaries or the probable cause. This is reading the narratives 2 and 3 times, going into the docket, reading supporting documents. So there's been a ton of work that has gone into this. Now, E3 complements other kinds of flight training, and this is important. We don't want to duplicate what everybody else is doing. No point in doing that. So traditional flight training, you've got completion standards. Can you hold your altitude and headings and all this stuff? There are specific techniques that are taught in regular flight training. The ACS will say, do this in this way. But what can happen is when you get outside of the very middle of your comfort zone and start to get out into unfamiliarity, your skills can degrade. We don't want that to happen. And certainly once you get way outside your comfort zone, that's where the accidents are going to happen. Nobody has accidents when they're in their comfort zone and they know exactly what the airplane's doing. So E3, the expanded envelope exercises, we're going to focus on the sensations. What does it feel like to put in full aileron deflection at traffic pattern speeds? Anybody ever done that? Okay, so that's something, you know, that ought to be in your bag of tricks in case you need it. You know, if someday if you need it, hey, we've been there, we've done it. When you're doing steep turns, the way steep turns are typically taught is watch this, get your bank angle, get your pitch, all this stuff, and all the sensations of the roll and the sight picture and the G sensations. You're just sort of taught to muscle through those, and you never make friends with them. E3 will show that the airplane is not limited by specific techniques. You know, there's lots of manuals and books and pilots that tell you this is the way that the airplane flies. But when I've tried those in my RV-9A, I've discovered that my RV-9A does not know how to read. And so with the expanded envelope, you're going to be more comfortable, and this will expand the overall cognitive availability of the pilot, your ability to track everything you need to. So here's where E3 fits in with flight training. On the left, all the green is sort of regular stuff, licenses and endorsements. And on the right is kind of all the various forms of loss of control recovery, unusual attitudes, spins, upset, and aerobatics. And E3 fills that gap in the middle. And what's interesting is E3 is all about flying within 60 degrees of bank, 30 degrees of pitch, no parachutes, 2 Gs, and no spins. So you can do it pretty much in any normal category aircraft. Of course, when we did this in the Baron, we didn't do any stalls. No surprise, you normally don't stall twins except under the most benign circumstances. And the point is that if we can maintain cognitive availability, paying attention to what's going on, that will help us avoid all kinds of loss of control. So here's a quote from the NTSB, and I'll let you read it. And it says, greater pilot situational awareness can make a difference. Well, cognitive availability is not quite the same as situational awareness. Situational awareness is big picture, weather, traffic, where we're going. And what I'm talking about in terms of cognitive availability is what's the airspeed? How many Gs are we pulling? What's the roll rate? What's the control deflection? What is the airframe doing right now? So cognitive availability is tactical. Situational awareness is strategic, big picture. So here's another example of the 6090s. You saw this in a not so good video. And so we're going to go, there we are, full aileron deflection. And we turn 90 degrees. Now note the pitch attitude, note the bank angles. Notice how precisely we come out on the points each time. Okay, how precise was the pitch attitude? Good, bad, or indifferent? It wasn't really all that good. We had the pitch going up a couple of degrees, and if we were doing steep turns, that would have screwed up the maneuver. But since this is an exercise, we want to see what it looks like. So we don't care about the pitch. We don't want to be distracted by holding the pitch precisely. We want to get the feel of full aileron deflection. We want to get the sight picture of the high roll rate. So you with me there is how this is different from a maneuver with completion standards? A little bit different. So benefits beyond the original goals. The original goals: reduce all kinds of loss of control accidents, improve cognitive availability. You'll hear me hit on that a couple of times more. And fun. I mean, lots of guys, you know, after they get their licenses, well, now what do we do? Well, here's something else to do that's fun. No hardware required, normal category aircraft. And then we've got lots of benefits that were unexpected that you might guess from people becoming more at home in their airplane, more familiar with more of the flight envelope. And there's some surprises in there. One is that if a pilot has gaps in their flight training, this will often show up in E3. So for example, a lot of pilots don't have good rudder skills, and when they get to E3, E3 is not teaching technique, but if they don't have any rudder skills, it will become available. Now, here's a key point. E3 is not duplicating other kinds of flight training, and it's not trying to be a checkout or a flight review. And the reason is everybody's already got those bases covered. So there's no point in diluting the E3 work to do stuff that everybody else is doing. There's lots of peripheral debates. You know, there's this big debate about PTS versus ACS. Let other people worry about that. E3 will stay on E3. But E3 elements can be borrowed. In the video you saw, it said that E3 was going to be incorporated into the focused flight review. That has happened. So that's quite an endorsement. So what the Air Safety Institute has done is found the exercises that really make sense for our flight review in their context, for their purposes, and they've appropriated appropriate exercises. And E3 and proficiency are different and distinct. Proficiency means that in the middle of the envelope where you've got your ratings and your certificates, you can fly well, you can fly to standards. E3 says you're comfortable out here outside of the middle of the envelope. You can have somebody who's real good in the middle of the envelope, very proficient, and lost out here. Similarly, you can have somebody who's at home out here who can't fly worth a hoot in here. So you see how the two are different and they complement each other? You guys look like you're all baked like roasted chickens. Okay, now here is a fun exercise that's we can do as a warm-up on an E3 flight. And this is a stall and a recovery and a turn. So in this, we start at cruise speed, 30 degrees of bank, slow the plane, dirty it up, stall it in 30 degrees of bank, and recover in 30 degrees of bank. We never go level. And then after people do that, they say, well, gee, that wasn't such a big deal. I say, okay, let's have a little more fun. Do the same thing, stall it in a 30-degree bank, and at the full stall break, recover 30 degrees the other way. So let's see what this looks like.
So here's a turning stall with recovery in the turn. We'll go to 30 degrees of bank and pull the power all the way back. Right now we start at 105 knots, which is less than cruise speed, but that's okay. We'll keep adding back pressure. We're at flap speed, so we'll add full flaps. Keep adding back pressure. Holding altitude, back pressure.
That's the stall warning horn.
Go 30 degrees of bank. There's the stall. So we'll add a little bit of power and ease off on the stick. We're not going to shove the stick forward. And ease in the power and let the plane fly itself out of the stall. And we'll get the flaps up. And normally we'd continue in the turn until we had our normal speed back up, but we're not going to do that this time. Now we're going to do kind of the same thing, but with the recovery in a 30-degree bank the opposite way. So we're at 80 knots now. We'll ease the power all the way back. Put in full flaps. Add back pressure. Stick all the way back. There's the stall brake. We gently roll the other way. Ease off some on the stick. Add some power. Fly out of it, nice and smooth and gentle. Power back in.
Lucian 5578, center departure, radar contact, maintain 1010,000.
Now the flaps up. And there we are. Not that big a deal.
And that's the point. It's not that big a deal. But this is different. I bet not many people have done a stall and a turn and recover in the opposite direction. Now, we'll hit the safety aspect later on, but you as pilot in command, FAR 91.3A, who's the final authority for the operation of the aircraft? So on a Citabria, I'm told that if you do this and you honk the stick over, you can spin the plane. So just because I did it in the RV-9A doesn't mean this is safe in every plane. But on the other hand, this is so easy. But it's interesting, I flew with one guy who had a ton of tactical jet experience. And I told him what we were going to do, and he did a stall and recovered textbook, books level, wings level. And I says, yeah, that's perfect, but we're going to stay in the stall. And he, okay, so what did that say about his comfort zone? We were going to go outside his comfort zone. And after he did it, it's sort of like, that's all, and that's the point. Okay, now here's something that's interesting. This is not part of E3, this is just kind of fun. What's the stall speed of an RV-9 in an 80-degree bank? Wings level would be about 55 knots. Anybody want to guess? $110? 90, okay? This is in an 80-degree bank. And the reason for doing this is vertical stalls in vertical banks show up in accident reports. I never read about one, and so I wanted to see what one was like. Experimental amateur built, phase 1 flight test, book legal, spirit of the law legal, entirely legal to do this. So here we are.
Lower the nose. Nose comes up. Unload the wing. Vertical. Stall it. There's the stall brake. And we recover.
Okay, that was a stall in an 80-degree bank at 58 knots. And the reason it was so slow, it was a less than 1G stall. So what does it look like when a plane stalls in a vertical bank? The nose drops a little bit. Interesting thing to know. Like I say, not part of E3, but really kind of a cool experiment to do. Now here we got into another area. Loss of control is more than stall spin. And this is a figure by a fellow named Mike Bromfield, who's now at the University of Birmingham in England. And he's done a bunch of really cool stuff. But you'll notice the two yellow boxes, one is stall and the other is unusual attitude. And both of those can roll into loss of control. And I found two other research papers that say much the same thing. And we'll get into more detail later on. But what this says is that if you're only concerned with angle of attack stall, loss of control, you're not covering all your bases. Now, here's a quote from Drs. Wiegman and Chappell, who did HFACS, Human Factors Analysis and Classification System, which is the big tool in accident analysis. And look at what's underlined here. You know, the difficulty with these highly practiced and seemingly automatic behaviors is they are particularly susceptible to attention or memory failures. So if there's something you do all the time and you're not paying attention to it, that's when you can have the mistake and cause the problem. So here's another endorsement from the literature that sort of says the same things as E3. Now let's talk about the base to final turn, everybody's favorite accident scenario. So if the pilot perceives a need for a sharper turn and they focus too much on aligning with the runway, they're spending so much time on runway alignment, they're not paying attention to the pitch. So watch this video and pay attention to where your eyes are drawn. What are you looking at when you watch this video? Okay, what were your eyes looking at? Nice and loud so everybody can hear. Into the runway threshold. Center line. Okay, what was the bank angle during this turn to final, and how much did it change? Okay, what was the pitch angle, and how much did it change? Okay, so I set you up here to watch for the runway and ignore everything else. But a stressed pilot is going to do just that. Watch one particular aspect and ignore everything else. Now, you may have noticed that there was one point where your instinct was, gee, if we just tighten this turn up a little bit more, we got it made. Anybody get that feeling? That's where you get into trouble. So this is obviously not a real-world video, but just to make a point. So how do we avoid the perceived need for a steeper turn? How many people were taught as private pilots or student pilots, don't overshoot final? Am I the only one? Oh, a lot of people. Okay, so what does that tell you? Don't overshoot final because what? You're going to stall, the wings are going to fall off, the boogeyman's going to get you, or just don't do it. And it becomes ingrained, the law of primacy. And so what can happen is people not wanting to overshoot final will do an unnecessarily steep turn to avoid an unfamiliar situation simply because that situation is unfamiliar, not because it's dangerous. So what we do in E3 is we experience a base to final overshoot. We fly one deliberately to see what it looks like. And again, I flew with some very experienced pilots, and I mentioned this, and yeah, we're going to do what? And we'll safely explore this. And what this says is an overshoot is oh shucks, I didn't want to do that. It's not an emergency. That's the wrong video. Oh, I've hit backwards, that's it. So what we'll do is we'll fly base 2 miles out, and we won't turn final until we cross the runway center line. Think that'll guarantee an overshoot? Yeah. And then what we will do is, in effect, S turns on final, but just sort of not paying any attention, we'll say, okay, we're going to align with this side, this taxiway, and then we'll come over and align with this taxiway. And what we're learning is that we can adjust, and it's not a big deal. We're in control of the airplane. And then the final thing we will do is, instead of landing on the center line, we'll land at some particular point offset, a seam in the asphalt, expansion joints in the concrete. And what we're learning, what we're experiencing, the sensations we're getting, is we put the airplane where we want to, where we command the airplane to, not where we put it to out of habit or out of fear or out of ignorance because we've never done anything else. So here we go, and we're now 2 miles out, and we just crossed the runway center line. Hey, look, we're going to line up with the taxiway on the right side of the runway. And you'll notice these are very, very docile banks, 20 and 30 degree banks. Nothing exciting here at all. So now we'll mosey over to the other side of the runway, and we'll line up with something there. Now we'll go back to the other side of the runway, and are we in control of the airplane? Are we getting the sensation that we are in command of the airplane? You betcha. Okay, so now we're on short final, and we will align with our desired touchdown point. In this case, I decided for this video I was going to land 2 expansion joints left of center line. So I'm doing what I want to do because I've made that conscious decision. And there's the expansion joint. And again, not that big a deal. But in terms of expanding your envelope, hey, if I overshoot the runway, yeah, okay, I've done it. Shame on me. Not a big deal. Everybody with me there? Okay, now, this is interesting. This is 4 ways to botch a base to final turn. I gave a similar presentation this morning. I've now got 5. One of the guys in the audience had some good information to share. But if you have too much bank and too little back pressure in your turn, the nose can drop. That's a steep turn out of control, except with the distraction, it's what I call a low-speed spiral. And if you say, gee, the nose is dropping, I'm going to spin, and you push the stick forward and you're already headed down, that's a whole lot worse. Then there's also the case of too much rudder and too much back pressure can give you a spin out the bottom, and too much bank and too much top rudder is a spin out the top. And what the man this morning shared with me is a nice video, is that if you use too much rudder, the dihedral effect and overbanking is another way you can get into a low-speed spiral. But what's interesting is both these spins and spirals have as a root cause cognitive unavailability. You're paying too much attention to the wrong things, not enough attention to the right things. Now, if we look at this graph, well, as I was mentioning earlier, low-speed spiral is like a steep turn without enough back pressure. And the key difference is distraction, it's not technique. That line, that curved line you've seen on the left side is the vertical axis is G-load, and the right side is bank angle, and that line is how many G's you need for a level turn. So if you have a lot of bank and not enough G's, that red oval in the bottom, that's where you get the low-speed spirals. That's for the engineers in the group. Now here is something interesting. This is the first low-speed spiral that I saw, and fortunately my plane had digital data recording, and each line here is 1 second. So if you look at the left column angle of attack, you can see that the angle of attack got up to 0.56 in the recovery. This was a low angle of attack, loss of control. This is ball centered, although that's not shown here. We started at 66 knots. You see, when I took the recovery at the green line about halfway down, we were at 78 knots. And the max speed we got was 99 knots, which was 13 knots below VA. So we had fat margins in those regards. But look at the bank angle. We got to 80 degrees of bank. That wasn't part of anybody's program. And look at the pitch. When I took over, we were at 30 degrees nose down, and we achieved 36. Anybody been in an unusual attitude of 60 degrees bank and 36 degrees nose down? And the horizon's kind of up there, and you're looking out forward, and it's like, I know there's a horizon somewhere. It's very disorienting. And you can see this was low G. We hit 4,000 feet a minute down. That's pretty impressive. And we lost 390 feet. Having practiced this, I now can demonstrate this, and we typically lose 500 feet. It's between 400 and 800 feet, and you can lose it that quick. So let's see what that looks like. Anybody want to see that? Okay, so here we are, and we start our bank. Oh, where's the runway? Oh my gosh. And we recover. So that's 60 degrees of bank, 30 degrees nose down, 500 feet of altitude loss. Just like that. Low angle of attack, ball centered, loss of control. So the question is, if we're talking about the low-speed spirals, how real are they? Is this just something I dreamed up? I did a study of 551 NTSB reports on RV series home-built airplanes, and there are 151 fatalities. These are the ones that qualified as loss of control, and the 3 on the left are the ones that were classified as stall spin in the NTSB reports. If you really look at the reports closely, and all the details and the docket and everything, 7 of them were not spins. They were very clearly low-speed spirals. 4 of them were very clearly stall spins, and 13 of them were, well, you can't really tell. So this doesn't mean that low-speed spirals are twice as common as stall spins. It says they're both significant. So if your whole vocabulary is stall spin, you're missing out potentially on half the accidents. How's that for an interesting tidbit of data. And if we look at stall spin versus G for level turn, again, we saw in that earlier video, you can stall at less than 1G. We all know you can stall at more than 1G. As long as you keep the wings on, you can stall at any speed. And that same attitude that can give you a spin can give you a low-speed spiral. So E3 is going to let you get out of your comfort zone and see these things over here. So if you get out of your comfort zone and you're tempted to tighten things up on your base to final turn, you say, oh, I've been here. I know not to tighten it up. I know it's not a big deal. And all this is to help you retain your cognitive availability. Risk management. Anybody ever seen this before? Everybody's favorite FAR? When you do E3, you as pilot and command are responsible for what's legal, what's safe. Not me, not some E3 publication, not what your friends, you as pilot and command. I think I mentioned earlier that when you're doing the 60-90s in a Citabria, if you honk the ailerons across, you can make it spin. When we did E3 in a Beach Baron, a twin, we didn't do any of the stalls because that wasn't part of an acceptable risk profile. So in terms of how much risk is acceptable, we want E3 risk to be no more than commercial maneuvers. And that's, pretty reasonable level. So no stall spins are close to it. Almost all of E3 is flown below maneuvering speed, so we're not going to overspeed the airplane, we're not going to over-G it. Almost all of E3 is flown with the flaps up. Many planes will have low flap extension speeds, and they'll have a 2G limit with the flaps extended. So we just fly with the flaps up as a general rule of thumb. If you have a retractable gear plane, when you do the low speed spiral and you put the gear out, all that extra drag means that the speed doesn't get out of control. So that's an advantage of retractable gear for flying E3. And again, the low speed spiral is demonstrated only because, let's put it gracefully, I found that even pilots who should know better when I was coaching them got pretty carried away. So what does it take to teach E3? You need to have basic instructor competency beyond Part 141. If Part 141 teaches you to be real good here, if you're going to teach E3, you need to have seen things out here. And, favorite quote, I don't know where it came from, nobody buys a book to learn how to swim. In the same way, you don't want to just say, okay, I've read the book on E3. I'm going to go out and experience a bunch of unfamiliar sensations. Another quick war story. I was flying with one guy who was a retired airline captain who was a transition pilot for one of the popular airplanes. And we were doing 60-90s. 60 degrees of bank, 90 degrees of turn, 60, 60, 60. Well, almost. What he did was 60 degrees of bank, 50 degrees of bank, 40 degrees of bank, 30 degrees of bank. So what this said was that his comfort zone, he could sort of barely get outside of his comfort zone, and then he had to come scooting back in. He couldn't do 4 60-degree banks. It was too uncomfortable for him. So that's kind of an example of why you don't want to just go out and try this on your own. What airplanes are suitable? Any normal category airplane. We've mentioned Citabrias and Barons. We've flown it in a whole bunch of planes. No real problems. And of course, double check your POH for any limitations. Now, another interesting question. E3 was not designed for primary training or training for licenses, but some parts are really very useful. Like one university is thinking about putting the deliberate runway overshoot into their student pilots' pre-solo curriculum so that they learn that if they overshoot the runway, that's an aw shucks, not something, oh my gosh, I got to do something about it. And the law of primacy will then stick with them and say throughout their flying career, if they overshoot the runways, they're, oh gee, I wish I hadn't done that. Let me tell you a war story on me. I've been doing all this research for the past 5 or 6 years, and I'm flying the RV-9A downwind. I think I left my other IQ point in the hangar. Got a little bit of tailwind on base. I'm turning final, and I'm going to overshoot the runway. And guess what my first response was? I gotta tighten up the turn. Do you think I knew better consciously? And what was my emotional response? I gotta tighten up the turn. E3, when student pilots see this before solo, should help them avoid that. Some of these more frisky exercises would be appropriate for pilots to be at home after they get their private, according to this university. And then the other thing is, since low-speed spirals are as dangerous and as prevalent as spins, if CFIs need to know how to do spins, shouldn't they know how to do low-speed spirals? Shouldn't they have seen them? Okay, so E3, old slide, E3 is in the focus flight review these days, and there are some other adaptations that have been slowed down by COVID. You've probably heard of that. But here's something that's real interesting. BCA Digest is a web publication for the BizJet community. And I was talking to the editor of this, and she says, why don't you write a viewpoint column? So I wrote about E3 and its potential applicability to BizJets, and look what one of the readers said. Said E3 was both practical and revolutionary at the same time. I'll take that kind of a compliment. So next steps for E3. Get it industry-wide. You know, this is easy to do, it's fun, it improves flying in so many ways. This ought to be industry-wide. Some planes will have little gotchas, details. Like on a Cirrus, if you're doing the 60-90s, if you do it at 100 knots, the nose is too high, flaps up. So 105 knots really works well for a Cirrus. Those kinds of details. Further refinement. I've done a real good first pass on E3, but there's always room for improvement. Folks here are going to know things that I don't. And also I think it's important to get a users consortium so that the lessons learned get spread out. You know, we don't need to have 55 people learn the same lesson. You know, let one person learn it and spread it around. And there's my email there, and I also have business cards so you can track me down more easily. We've already talked about this, and we talked about this. These slides duplicated. If you search for my name and E3 on YouTube, you'll find the introductory video. You'll find the Sun and Fun presentation done 4 months ago. This presentation should be on this evening. And there's also a 90-minute E3 presentation that I did for an EAA chapter in Dallas as a Zoom meeting. And if you want a challenge, try doing a Zoom meeting for 90 minutes with no feedback. So that's that. Open invitation. Come fly with me in Savannah. Now I've got a letter of designated authority. So if you come fly with me, I can charge you and make you buy me lunch. Or we can fly in your plane, or we can fly in both. And there's a possibility, not a good possibility, but maybe a possibility of flying here at the show. Tomorrow night is the EA Founders Innovation Prize at 7 o'clock, and I will be presenting E3 as a solution to loss of control, and the 4 competitors are all hardware solutions, meaning you have to buy the hardware and install it in your airplane, and if you go in another airplane that doesn't have it, too bad. So prayers appreciated, and show up and cheer, I hope. And here's a quote from the NTSB. I don't think we saw this earlier, talking about situational awareness can make a difference when we talked about airplane awareness versus situational awareness. And if any of you folks know some students who are looking for master's or doctoral level thesis topics, I got a bunch. Oh, let's see, we've got 5 minutes. Let me hold off on, go ahead, what's your question real quick?
How can we adapt this to turns in a canyon?
Turns in a canyon is a technique. E3 is experience, it's not technique. So they're different. With me there? What you can do is you can say, hey, let's go off and see what things look like, you know, steep turns and all sorts of stuff. But E3 is not technique. Canyon turns are technique. Now, there's been a lot of talk on stalls after takeoff. Here is a Kit Fox taking off, and he suffers a power loss, and this is apparently a climb at VX. Uh-oh. So that's a climb at VX, and what this means, when you climb at that angle, you don't have a lot of airspeed margin. Your best glide is a long way away in pitch. And in fact, I've heard that JARS and MAF, the two big missionary organizations that fly out of really short fields, they don't use VX, they climb at VY. VX is a specialty or an emergency maneuver. Now here is an amphibian with a high thrust line that's climbing out steeply, and he will suffer an engine loss in a steep climb, but he's got a high thrust line, so he will pitch up on engine loss. So there's an unnecessarily steep, possibly a VX climb. There's the engine loss. Uh-oh. So the message from these two is when you're thinking about VX, VY climb, and that's a whole other topic really deserving of research, cut yourself a lot of slack. Now this last one is a guy landing in Australia at, well, not quite VSO, maybe VSO -1. And you can see how he just sort of rolled off there. So cut yourself a lot of slack when you're doing these things.